She got lost in the woods during a solo hike and found an old frontier-era wagon hut. Night, storm, and a house built to survive. In the morning, she realized why what was inside had been waiting for over 100 years. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. She had chosen the trail precisely because it promised nothing dramatic. That, more than anything, was the point. At 47, she had grown wary of stories that advertised transformation, danger, or revelation. She no longer believed that meaning arrived with force. If it came at all, it did so quietly, through repetition, through long stretches of silence broken only by breath and footfall. The trail followed an old frontier corridor deep in the Pacific Northwest, a place marked on historical maps, but rarely walked now. It was considered safe, unremarkable, and forgettable, and she trusted it for those very reasons. Her life, in the months leading up to the hike, had settled into a narrow rhythm. Work filled the weekdays, not because it demanded her completely, but because it asked just enough to keep questions at bay. Evenings passed without urgency. She cooked simple meals, read until her eyes tired, and slept lightly. Friends worried about her isolation, but she did not see it that way. Solitude was not absence, it was space. She had learned that after the slow unraveling of a marriage that ended not with betrayal or anger, but with exhaustion, two people can wear each other down without ever raising their voices. When it was over, she did not feel broken. She felt hollowed, as if something unnecessary had finally been removed. Hiking had always been her way of recalibrating. Not conquest, not escape, but alignment. She walked to place her body back inside the world, to remind herself that gravity still worked, that muscles still responded, that the ground remained solid beneath her boots. This particular route had appealed to her because of its layered history. It was once a wagon path, later a supply corridor, then a logging road, and now little more than a suggestion winding through old-growth forest. She liked places where human intention lingered faintly, where effort had once been spent and then abandoned. Such places felt honest. Preparation had been routine. She packed for 3 days, though she planned to hike only 2. Food was measured and practical, gear checked and rechecked. Her experience told her what she needed and what she did not. The forecast was favorable, cool but stable, the kind of late autumn weather that sharpens the air without threatening it. She had studied the map the night before, tracing the trail with her finger, noting elevation changes, landmarks, water sources. There was nothing on it that suggested risk, no steep drop-offs, no river crossings that couldn't be bypassed. She'd smiled at the simplicity of it. The forest welcomed her without ceremony. Towering firs filtered the light into long, green shafts. The ground was soft with needles and decades of decay, a living carpet that muffled sound. As she walked, she noticed details she always noticed. The way moss thickened on the northern sides of trunks, the faint indentation where wagon wheels had once cut into the earth, the way the air smelled different where sunlight reached the ground. These details steadied her. They were small proofs of continuity. People had passed here before, and life had gone on without them. For the first several hours, the trail behaved exactly as expected. It rose gently, dipped, curved around stands of trees, and occasionally widened where old equipment had once been dragged through. She stopped once to drink water and eat a handful of nuts, standing quietly as a bird hopped along a fallen branch nearby. She felt no urgency. Time stretched, then dissolved, as it often did when she walked alone. Her thoughts drifted, then thinned, then fell away entirely. It was mid-afternoon when the first change came, subtle enough that she might have missed it if she had been less attuned. The light shifted, not dimming exactly, but flattening, as if the forest had inhaled. A breeze moved through the upper branches, stronger than before, carrying a colder edge. She checked her watch and then the sky, glimpsing it through the canopy. Clouds had gathered where there had been none that morning, thick and low, pressing against the horizon. Weather changed quickly in these regions. She knew that. Still, the forecast had been clear. She adjusted her pack straps and continued, telling herself that a little rain would not matter. The trail, however, began to misbehave. It narrowed unexpectedly, then split briefly before rejoining. Fallen branches obscured sections she remembered as open. She slowed, scanning for familiar markers, but the ground offered fewer clues than before. The forest, so legible earlier, seemed to blur. By the time the first drops fell, she had already begun to feel the discomfort that accompanies uncertainty. Not fear, exactly, but a tightening awareness that control was slipping. Rain gathered on leaves and released in sudden cold splashes. The wind strengthened, pushing against her from different directions, as if undecided. She pulled on her jacket and paused, turning slowly in a full circle, trying to orient herself. The trail behind her looked less distinct than she expected. Ahead, it dissolved into shadow. She made a calculated choice to move forward, reasoning that the terrain would eventually correct itself. But minutes passed, then more, and the path grew increasingly ambiguous. What had once been a corridor now felt like a suggestion. Water pooled in shallow depressions, erasing footprints almost as soon as she made them. The rain intensified, falling harder, driven sideways by gusts that rattled branches and sent debris skittering across the ground. It was then that she saw it, or rather, noticed something that did not belong. At first glance, it appeared to be a fallen tree, its shape distorted by vines and shadow. But there was a geometry to it that stopped her. Straight lines where none should exist. Angles softened by time but not erased. She took a step closer, then another, heart beginning to beat with cautious attention rather than alarm. As she approached, the form resolved itself slowly, like an image coming into focus. Wooden wheels, partially sunken into the earth. A long frame, reinforced, darkened by age. Above it, walls built up and outward, enclosing the original structure in a shell of logs and planks. It was not merely a wagon left to rot. It was a wagon that had been transformed, made to stay. She stood there as the rain fell harder, soaking her sleeves, her breath visible now in the cooling air. The forest pressed close around the structure, as if trying to reclaim it, but the thing itself endured. She felt the strange pull of recognition, the sense that she had stumbled upon something intentional, something shaped by need and thought. Whatever it was, it had not been meant as a temporary shelter. It had been meant to last. The wind howled through the trees, and thunder rolled distantly, low and heavy. She realized, with sudden clarity, that continuing to wander in this weather would be dangerous. The light was already fading, the storm gaining strength. She took one last look around, committing the surrounding trees to memory, then turned her full attention back to the structure before her. She did not yet know what she was standing in front of, or how deeply it would alter her understanding of both the past and herself. All she knew in that moment was that the route she had chosen for its safety and simplicity had quietly closed behind her, and something else had opened instead. She remained where she was for several long moments, letting the rain soak into the outer layers of her jacket while she studied the structure from a careful distance. The storm had given the forest a restless urgency, branches creaking, leaves shivering, the air thick with the smell of wet wood and earth. Against that movement, the wagon house stood unnaturally still. It did not lean or sway. It seemed to have settled into the ground, with deliberate finality, as if it had chosen this exact patch of forest and refused to move again. She approached slowly, circling it the way one might circle an unfamiliar animal, alert for signs of collapse or danger. The wheels were the first detail that anchored her understanding. They were unmistakable, iron-rimmed and massive, though half swallowed by soil and roots. Moss had grown over the lower spokes, and a young sapling leaned against one hub as if it had always belonged there. The wagon frame above them was reinforced with heavy beams, fitted together with a precision that spoke of time, skill, and patience. This had not been thrown together in desperation. It had been built with care. As she traced the outline with her eyes, the logic of it began to reveal itself. The original wagon body formed the core, its length and proportions still visible beneath later additions. Around it, walls had been raised, not crudely, but thoughtfully, using local timber, shaped to fit the contours of the original structure. The seams were tight, the joints were solid. Whoever had done this had known how to work wood, and more importantly, had known why they were doing it. This was not a shelter meant to be abandoned after a night or two. This was a decision. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof, and she realized there was a pitched overhang above part of the structure, a makeshift awning that extended just enough to shield the entrance from direct runoff. It was a small but telling detail. She imagined someone standing here long ago, adjusting the angle, testing it in bad weather, refining it until it worked. That image brought with it a quiet respect. This place had been shaped by trial and error, by someone who intended to survive. She hesitated at the doorway. The door itself was intact, a solid slab of wood reinforced with iron hardware dulled by age. It did not hang open like the doors of abandoned barns she had seen before. It was closed, as if waiting. Her hand hovered inches from the latch. She felt the familiar tension of trespass, even though reason told her that whoever had lived here was long gone. There are boundaries that persist, even after the people who set them disappear. She was aware of crossing one. Another gust of wind swept through the clearing, colder than before, driving rain into her face. The storm was no longer a distant inconvenience. It was a threat. She weighed her options with the calm practicality that had guided her on countless hikes. Continuing to wander in worsening weather without a clear trail was dangerous. Staying outside offered no shelter and no certainty. Entering the structure meant violating an invisible line, but it also meant warmth, safety, and time to think. She lifted the latch and pushed the door open. The interior revealed itself gradually, as her eyes adjusted from the gray light outside to the dim, enclosed space within. The air inside was dry, astonishingly so, carrying the faint scent of old wood and ash rather than dampness or rot. That alone told her she had not misjudged the place. Water had been kept out. The structure had held. The space was compact, but carefully organized. The wagon's original curvature shaped the room, giving it a narrow, elongated feel, but every inch had been used with intention. Along one wall ran a built-in bench with storage beneath it, the lid worn smooth by use. Opposite it stood a small table, folded flat against the wall, secured with a simple latch. Shelves lined the upper sections, their contents neatly arranged, untouched by chaos or decay. Nothing lay scattered. Nothing felt abandoned in haste. Her attention was drawn immediately to the stove. It sat near the center of the structure, compact but solid, with a flue that disappeared upward through the roof. The metal was dark with age, but intact, its surface bearing the marks of long use rather than neglect. She crouched beside it, examining the seams, the ash drawer, the vents. It was a sophisticated piece of equipment for its time, more refined than she would have expected in a frontier wagon. The flue pipe had been carefully routed, insulated where it passed near wood. Someone had understood the dangers of fire and had worked meticulously to prevent them. As she stood and turned slowly, absorbing the space, a realization settled over her. This was not simply a wagon repurposed as a cabin. It was an early form of mobile living, a self-contained system designed for movement and then adapted for stillness. Like a modern recreational vehicle, it balanced portability with permanence. It was ingenious, and it unsettled her to recognize how modern the thinking behind it felt. The storm outside pressed harder, wind rattling the structure's outer walls, but inside there was only a muted echo of that violence. She closed the door behind her, testing the latch. It held firm. The sense of intrusion softened, replaced by a cautious gratitude. Whoever had built this place had done so to endure storms like this one. She was not violating its purpose by seeking refuge. She was fulfilling it. She began a more careful exploration, moving slowly, touching nothing at first, simply noting. There were hooks set into the walls for hanging tools or clothing. A narrow bunk folded down from one end of the wagon, its frame sturdy, its mattress long since gone, but the shape unmistakable. Beneath it, drawers slid open smoothly, revealing folded fabric that crumbled at her touch, reduced to dust by time. The care with which they had been stored made their fragility more poignant. Near the stove, she noticed a series of small markings carved into the wood, not decorative but practical. Measurements, perhaps, or notes. She leaned closer and saw faint writing, names, dates, short lines etched with a steady hand. These were not graffiti. They were records, the kind made by someone who intended to remember. Her pack felt suddenly heavy on her shoulders, a reminder of her own temporary presence. She set it down near the door and shrugged out of her jacket, shaking off as much moisture as she could. The interior temperature was cool but stable, not the biting cold of the forest. She imagined what it must have been like to sit here during a winter storm, the stove glowing, the walls holding fast while snow piled against them outside. The thought carried both comfort and an unexpected weight. Someone had trusted this place with their life. She returned to the stove, kneeling again, this time opening the ash drawer. It slid free easily, revealing old ash compacted into a hard gray layer. She scraped a bit with her finger. Dry. The flue, then, must still be clear. She followed it with her eyes, noting the careful construction where it passed through the roof. Everything about the place spoke of long-term thinking, of a refusal to leave survival to chance. Only then did the deeper question rise, unavoidable now that the immediate urgency had been addressed. If this place had been built to last, if it had been lived in with care and foresight, why was it empty? There were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no hurried abandonment. It was as if the occupants had simply stepped out and never returned. The storm answered with another violent gust, rattling the walls and sending a low moan through the trees. She knew she would not find the answer tonight. Darkness was closing in, and the weather showed no sign of relenting. Whatever story this place held would reveal itself slowly, if at all. She unpacked with deliberate calm, laying out what she would need for the night, conserving energy, conserving thought. As she moved through the small space, it no longer felt foreign. It felt purposeful. The wagon had stopped moving long ago, but it had not ceased to function. It had waited, enduring seasons, storms, silence, until someone else found their way to it by accident rather than intention. As the light faded and the forest outside surrendered to darkness, she understood that the trail she had lost no longer mattered. The shelter she had found was not merely a pause in her journey. It was a threshold. Whatever lay ahead would begin here, inside a wagon that had once carried hope across a continent and had chosen, finally, to stay. By the time she accepted fully that she would be spending the night inside the wagon house, the forest outside had lost all definition. Rain no longer fell in discernible drops, but in sheets, driven hard against the walls by wind that rose and fell in unpredictable surges. The sound was not sharp, but heavy, a constant pressure that made the structure creak and answer in low, measured tones. It was the sound of a building being tested, not violently, but persistently, as if the storm were asking the same question over and over again, waiting to see if the answer would change. She stood in the center of the narrow interior, listening, letting the rhythm of it register in her body. Years of hiking had taught her to read weather, not as spectacle, but as force. This was no passing shower. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the rain carried with it a chill that settled into her clothes and skin. She felt it most in her hands, the stiffness creeping into her fingers as she flexed them. If she was going to stay here, she would need heat, and soon. The stove dominated the space more than she had realized at first. It was positioned slightly off-center, anchored firmly to the floor, its iron surface dark and matte, bearing the faint, uneven sheen of something that had once been polished by regular use. She crouched beside it again, this time with intent rather than curiosity. The practical part of her mind took over, assessing variables, recalling procedures she had learned in ranger-led workshops and backcountry courses. A stove, no matter how old, followed certain rules. Airflow mattered, fuel mattered, attention mattered. She opened the stove door carefully. Inside, remnants of old charcoal lay fused together, preserved by dryness rather than neglect. She brushed some of it aside, creating space. From her pack, she took a small fire starter and a bundle of kindling she always carried, habit ingrained by years of preparation. She hesitated before striking the spark, glancing up at the flue. Smoke would have nowhere to go if the chimney was blocked, and in a space this confined, that could be dangerous. Rising, she traced the flue pipe with her eyes, and then with her hand, following it upward to where it disappeared through the roof. There were no obvious cracks, no gaps where smoke might leak back into the room. Still, doubt lingered. She had learned long ago that confidence, untested by reality, was little more than assumption. She knelt again and struck the spark. The flame caught quickly, licking at the kindling, small but determined. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of relief. Then the smoke began to thicken, curling upward and then hesitating, as if unsure where to go. It pooled beneath the roof, stinging her eyes, making her cough despite herself. She cursed under her breath, quickly opening the door to let fresh air rush in. Wind tore at the opening, dragging rain inside and sending the flames sputtering. She extinguished the fire and leaned back against the wall, breathing hard, frustration rising. The storm outside was growing louder, more insistent, and now the interior of the wagon felt suddenly smaller, more precarious. The idea that this carefully built refuge might turn against her because of a simple mechanical failure unsettled her more than the weather itself. It was then that she noticed the markings again, this time more clearly. Near the stove, etched into the wood with deliberate strokes, were lines of writing, partially obscured by soot and age. She leaned closer, wiping the surface gently with the sleeve of her jacket. The words emerged slowly, their spelling archaic but legible, their meaning unmistakable. They were instructions, not formal, not complete, but practical notes written by someone who had learned through experience. Mentions of wind direction, of adjusting the vent when pressure dropped, of keeping the lower intake partially closed during heavy storms. This was not a manual meant for anyone else. It was a conversation with the future, left behind by someone who knew that memory alone was unreliable. She read the notes twice, committing them to memory. Then she adjusted the stove accordingly, opening a narrow vent near the base and partially closing another she had overlooked. She waited a moment, listening, feeling the air move differently in the room. When she struck the spark again, the flame caught and held. Smoke rose, hesitated, then was drawn upward decisively into the flue. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The system was working. As the fire grew, warmth began to spread slowly, unevenly at first, then with increasing confidence. The iron of the stove radiated heat that seeped into her chilled hands and feet, loosening muscles that had tightened without her noticing. She closed the door, securing it firmly, and watched as the small interior transformed. The storm outside did not diminish, but it receded, its presence softened by layers of wood and intention. She sat on the built-in bench, her back against the wall, and allowed herself to rest. Exhaustion crept in now that urgency had eased, the kind that settles deep rather than announcing itself loudly. Her thoughts, however, did not quiet. The act of following instructions left behind by someone long gone had stirred something unexpected in her. It was an intimacy she had not anticipated, a collaboration across time, practical and unromantic, yet deeply human. As the night advanced, the storm intensified. Rain gave way intermittently to sleet, tapping sharply against the roof before dissolving back into water. Wind howled through the trees, sending branches scraping against the walls with a sound like distant footsteps. Each impact made her tense, listening for signs of failure. But the structure held. The walls absorbed the blows without complaint. The roof did not leak. The flue continued to draw steadily, carrying smoke and danger away. She rose once to reinforce the door, sliding a thick wooden bar into place, another thoughtful detail left by the builder. The bar fit perfectly, its grooves worn smooth by repeated use. Someone had known fear here before. Someone had planned for nights exactly like this one. Later, as she rummaged through one of the drawers beneath the bench, her fingers brushed against paper. She froze, then withdrew her hand slowly, as if the object might vanish if startled. Carefully, she opened the drawer fully. Inside lay a small stack of folded pages, yellowed but intact, bound loosely with twine. Letters, she realized, or perhaps journal entries. The handwriting was dense, deliberate, slanted slightly to the right. She did not read them immediately. There was a boundary she hesitated to cross, even now. Instead, she placed them on the table and returned to tending the fire, adding fuel sparingly, mindful of conserving both wood and attention. When she finally sat again, the storm outside at its fiercest, she allowed herself to unfold the top page. The words pulled her in quietly. They were not dramatic. They spoke of daily concerns, of measurements and adjustments, of hopes deferred and recalculated, mentions of weather patterns, of illness, of the constant arithmetic of survival. There was no self-pity in the writing, only persistence. The writer did not ask for sympathy. He recorded facts. Time lost its shape as she read. The stove hummed softly, the fire a steady presence. Outside, the forest thrashed and groaned, but inside, a fragile equilibrium had been achieved. She felt herself inhabiting a space, not just physical, but temporal, held between her own life and another's, separated by more than a century, yet bound by shared need. Sleep came in fragments. She dozed on the bench, waking often to adjust the fire, to listen for changes in the storm, to reassure herself that the walls still stood. Each time she woke, she was struck by the same thought, quiet but insistent. This place had not been built as an experiment. It had been built as a promise that careful thought and sustained effort could hold back chaos, if only for a time. Toward morning, the storm's voice shifted. The rain softened, though the wind remained restless. She sat up, stiff and sore, and stared at the stove, its embers glowing faintly. The first night had been survived, not through luck, but through design and attention. She felt gratitude not just for shelter, but for the mind that had created it. As pale light began to filter through the small window, revealing the aftermath of the storm, she sensed that the Wagon house had more to offer than protection. The letters on the table seemed to wait, their presence now undeniable. Whatever story had ended here had not done so cleanly. And as the storm loosened its grip, she understood that the night had not been an interruption in her journey, but its beginning. Morning did not arrive as a clean break between darkness and light. It seeped in slowly, diluted by cloud cover and the lingering breath of the storm. The forest outside the small window looked unfamiliar, reshaped by rain and wind. Branches lay scattered across the ground, needles pressed flat into the mud, and the air carried a heavy stillness that followed violence. She sat upright on the bench, muscles stiff, head aching slightly from interrupted sleep, and listened. The storm had retreated, but it had not fully released its grip. Somewhere deeper in the woods, the wind still moved, restless and unresolved. She rose carefully, testing her balance, and crossed to the door. When she slid the wooden bar aside and opened it a narrow distance, cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. The clearing around the Wagon house was littered with debris. One tree, tall and dead long before the storm, had finally surrendered. It lay at an angle not far from the entrance, its trunk cracked and splintered where it had struck the ground. The fall had missed the structure by a matter of feet, close enough that she felt a tightening in her chest as she imagined the alternative. Luck had played a role, but not a dominant one. The house had been placed wisely. She stepped outside briefly, boots sinking into wet earth, and surveyed the damage. Her immediate concern was the trail. From what she could see, any clear path had been erased entirely. The storm had done its work thoroughly. Water had carved new channels, mudslides had softened slopes, and fallen branches formed chaotic barriers. Returning immediately was not an option. The realization did not bring panic, only a resigned clarity. She would be here another night, whether she planned to be or not. Inside, the Wagon house felt different in daylight. The dim interior that had seemed almost abstract the night before now revealed detail upon detail. The grain of the wood was visible, the marks of tools preserved like fingerprints. She rekindled the stove with practiced ease, adjusting the vents as she had learned from the notes. The system responded faithfully, heat returning to the space without resistance. Trust, once earned, came quickly. With the immediate needs addressed, her attention turned again to the letters and the larger story they hinted at. She brought them to the table and spread them carefully, smoothing creases, aligning edges. There were more pages than she had first realized, some folded inside others, some written on scraps of different sizes. This was not a single document, but a collection accumulated over time. She began to read from the earliest date she could find. The voice that emerged was steady, measured, unembellished. The writer recorded days and weeks with the same careful tone he applied to technical notes. He wrote of traveling west with his family, of setbacks that had forced them to stop sooner than planned. There were mentions of a wife whose health declined as the weather turned colder, of children whose energy masked the strain of constant movement. He described the decision to remain in this place, not as surrender, but as calculation. Winter was approaching. Supplies were limited. Pushing forward would have been reckless. As the entries progressed, the Wagon house took shape not just as a structure, but as a response to circumstance. He detailed modifications made as needs arose, insulation added, vents adjusted, storage expanded. Each improvement was documented with the same care as a ledger entry. There was pride in the work, but not vanity. He wrote as someone who believed that survival depended on accuracy rather than optimism. At one point, she paused, struck by a shift in tone. The entries grew shorter, more tightly focused. Illness appeared more frequently, not dramatized, simply acknowledged. The wife's strength waned. The children were tasked with responsibilities beyond their years. The house, which had been designed to protect, now served also as a boundary, keeping danger out while quietly trapping grief inside. She pushed the letters aside for a moment and stood, restless. The sense that the house contained more than she had yet seen pressed at her. The builder's thoroughness suggested redundancy, preparation for loss as much as for survival. She began a more methodical search, examining seams, testing panels, running her hands along the floor. Near the base of the bench, she felt a slight give beneath her fingers. A panel shifted when she applied pressure. She knelt, heart beating faster now, and worked it loose. Beneath it lay a narrow cavity, dry and carefully sealed. Inside were items wrapped in cloth that had once been white. She unwrapped them slowly. Silver coins glinted in the low light, their surfaces worn but unmistakable. Beside them lay a small leather pouch containing jewelry, simple but finely made. There were documents as well, folded and refolded, until the creases threatened to tear them apart. Deeds, she realized, and letters of credit, proof of intention, proof of a future that had been planned but never reached. She sat back on her heels, the weight of the discovery settling over her. These were not forgotten trinkets. They were reserves, safeguarded with purpose. The builder had hidden them here not to abandon them, but to protect them, perhaps with the intention of retrieving them later, perhaps with the hope that someone else would, if he could not. Returning to the table, she read on, her understanding deepening with each page. The final entries were sparse. Dates appeared without elaboration. The wife's name appeared less often, then not at all. One entry spoke of a decision to send the children ahead with a passing party once the weather broke, trusting that movement, even uncertain, was better than waiting. The house would remain behind, holding what they couldn't carry. The last page was written in a hand that trembled slightly, though the words remained precise. He wrote of plans to follow, of the intention to bring the remaining documents to a town, to a courthouse, to a museum perhaps, so that the design of the Wagon house might be preserved. He believed even then that what he had built mattered beyond his own life. The entry ended without conclusion, the ink fading where the pen had paused too long. She closed the final page and sat in silence. The house around her seemed to absorb the moment, its walls holding not just heat, but memory. The storm that had driven her here now felt incidental, a mechanism rather than a cause. This place had waited, not passively, but patiently, until someone capable of understanding it arrived. Her gaze returned to the hidden valuables. The ethical weight of them was undeniable. They represented not only material worth, but intention. To take them would be easy. No one would know. Yet the thought left her unsettled. These items had been set aside as part of a story that had not finished. To remove them without context would be to repeat the loss rather than resolve it. Night fell again sooner than she expected. The forest darkened under a sky still heavy with clouds, and the temperature dropped once more. She secured the door, tended the fire, and settled in for a second night. Unlike the first, this one was quieter. The storm's violence had passed, replaced by an uneasy calm. The sounds outside were subtle now, the occasional snap of cooling branches, the distant call of an unseen animal. As she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts circled the same point. She was no longer simply a hiker seeking shelter. She was a witness. The house had offered her warmth and safety. but it had also entrusted her with a responsibility she had not asked for and could not refuse. The second night did not bring new danger, but it brought clarity, and that, she understood, was sometimes the heavier burden. When sleep finally came, it was deeper than before, filled with images of movement halted and resumed, of wheels sinking into earth and then rolling again, not across land, but through time. And when she woke, she knew that leaving this place would not be an ending, but a continuation, one that would carry the house's story beyond the forest that had held it for so long. She woke before the light reached the window, stirred not by sound, but by a shift in the air. The wagon house felt different, as if it had exhaled. The cold was still present, but it no longer pressed in with the same insistence. The stove had burned low during the night, its embers reduced to a faint glow, and the silence outside was no longer tense. It was the silence that follows exertion, when the world pauses to assess what remains standing. She sat up slowly, careful of stiff joints and lingering fatigue, and listened. No rain struck the roof, no wind rattled the walls, only the distant drip of water falling from branches and the occasional soft creak of settling wood reached her ears. Dawn was coming, and with it, the first real opportunity to leave. She tended the stove one last time, not because she needed the heat immediately, but because the act itself had become part of the rhythm of the place. The fire responded easily, as if acknowledging familiarity. As warmth returned, she packed her belongings with deliberate care. Each item found its place in her pack, weighed and considered. When she came to the letters and documents, she paused. They lay where she had left them, stacked neatly on the table. The hidden valuables remained beneath the floor panel, untouched. She had thought about them through the night, turning the question over until it no longer felt like a question at all. Some choices, she realized, are resolved not through reasoning, but through recognition. This story was not hers to fragment. It had endured too long, intact, to be diminished now. She wrapped the papers carefully in a protective layer from her pack and secured them against her chest, close enough to feel their weight with every movement. They were not heavy in the physical sense, but they carried density, intention compressed into ink and fiber. She closed the floor panel again, sealing it as she had found it, and for a moment rested her hand on the wood, a silent acknowledgement of trust. Outside, the forest had been rearranged. What had once been an ambiguous tangle now bore the unmistakable signs of passage and force. Fallen trees lay like barriers, but they also created new lines of sight. The storm had stripped away some of the forest's opacity, revealing contours she could now read. The air was cold and clean, carrying the sharp scent of pine and wet soil. She adjusted her pack, stepped away from the wagon house, and then stopped. She turned back for a final look. In daylight, the structure appeared almost modest. It did not dominate the clearing or announce itself as remarkable. Its ingenuity was quiet, folded inward, visible only to those who knew how to look. She felt a tightening behind her ribs, an emotion that hovered between gratitude and something closer to grief. This place had offered her refuge, but it had also altered the trajectory of her journey in ways she couldn't yet measure. She memorized the surrounding trees, the angle of the light, the slope of the ground. Then she began to walk. The path out was slow and demanding. The storm had erased familiar markers, forcing her to rely on instinct, sharpened by experience. She navigated around fallen trunks, climbed over slick rock, and crossed stretches of mud that threatened to pull her boots free with each step. Her body protested, fatigue catching up now that adrenaline had faded. But she moved steadily, conserving energy, refusing to rush. As she walked, the contents of the letters replayed in her mind, not as a single narrative, but as fragments that formed a pattern. She thought of the builder's attention to detail, his refusal to leave anything to chance. She thought of the decision to stop moving, to accept stillness as strategy rather than defeat. The Wagon House had not been a symbol of failure. It had been an adaptation, a declaration that survival could take many forms. Hours passed before the first sign of civilization appeared, subtle at first. A cut in the trees that suggested an old logging road, a rusted marker half buried in moss. These signs did not bring relief so much as confirmation. She was moving in the right direction. When she finally reached a maintained trail, its surface compacted and deliberate, she allowed herself to stop and breathe deeply, letting the tension ease from her shoulders. By the time she reached the trailhead, her legs trembled with exhaustion. The small parking area was empty, as she had expected it would be. She leaned against her car for a long moment before unlocking it, grounding herself in the solid familiarity of metal and glass. Only then did she sit, remove her pack, and rest her forehead against the steering wheel. The drive back to town passed in a muted haze. The road wound through valleys and ridges that now felt strangely distant, as if she were already removed from the experience that had defined the past 2 days. When she stopped at a gas station, the ordinary noise of voices and engines felt intrusive, almost inappropriate. She moved through it politely, mechanically, aware that she was carrying something that did not belong to this casual present. She did not go home. Instead, she drove directly to the local historical society, a modest building set back from the main road, its sign weathered but intact. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polish. A woman behind the desk looked up, her expression shifting from polite neutrality to curiosity, as she took in the state of her visitor. The mud-streaked boots, the drawn face, the unmistakable look of someone who had come a long way with a purpose not yet spoken. The words came slowly at first. She described the hike, the storm, the discovery. Skepticism flickered briefly, then softened as she placed the papers on the desk and began to unfold them. Dates, names, sketches of construction details, careful diagrams of the stove system. The effect was immediate. Phones were lifted. Another staff member joined them, then another. Questions followed, precise and increasingly urgent. Within an hour, she found herself seated at a long table, answering inquiries from people who understood what they were seeing. The Wagon House, they said, was extraordinary. Not because frontier shelters were unheard of, but because this one represented a level of foresight and engineering rarely documented. The letters filled gaps in local records, offering insight into a family whose presence had been inferred, but never confirmed. She listened, answered when needed, and felt the strange sensation of becoming peripheral to something she had initiated. The story was already moving beyond her, attaching itself to systems and institutions designed to carry it forward. This did not feel like loss. It felt appropriate. Arrangements were discussed. A survey team would be assembled. The site would be assessed carefully, the structure documented before any attempt at relocation. Preservation, not possession, was the priority. When the subject of compensation arose, she declined immediately, then amended her refusal to something more measured. Recognition mattered, she said, but not ownership. The house did not belong to her. When she finally left the building, dusk had settled over the town. Lights glowed in windows, and the hum of evening traffic filled the streets. She stood for a moment on the steps, watching people pass, aware of how ordinary everything appeared. No one around her knew what had been uncovered in the forest, or how close it had come to being lost forever. That knowledge did not isolate her. It steadied her. As she drove home at last, fatigue settled into her bones, but it was accompanied by a quiet certainty. She had not sought this role, but she would carry it. The Wagon House had stopped moving long ago, Yet its journey was not over. She had simply opened the way. The weeks that followed unfolded with a momentum that felt both inevitable and strangely impersonal. Once the story left her hands, it did not slow down. It gathered attention the way water gathers force as it moves downhill, pulling in people, resources, authority. Calls came daily at first, then several times a day. Historians, preservation specialists, structural engineers. Each conversation returned to the same central fact. The Wagon House was not merely an artifact. It was a complete system, preserved almost impossibly intact, and that made it rare beyond measure. She accompanied the first survey team back into the forest. The trail, already damaged by the storm, was now marked deliberately, ribbons tied to branches, stakes driven into the ground. What had once been an accidental discovery was becoming a mapped site. The Wagon House stood exactly as she had left it, unchanged by the passage of time or attention. Seeing it again stirred a quiet recognition in her, like encountering an old friend whose presence required no explanation. The team moved slowly and reverently. Measurements were taken, photographs captured from every angle, notes scribbled and revised. They spoke in careful language, aware that one careless decision could compromise what had survived for more than a century. She watched as they traced the outlines she had memorized in the storm, now illuminated clearly in daylight. The wheels embedded in the earth, the reinforced frame, the additions layered with such precision that it was difficult to tell where wagon ended and cabin began. What impressed the experts most was not the structure itself, but its logic. They spoke of load distribution, of airflow, of insulation techniques that predated standardized building codes, yet met their principles intuitively. One engineer, older than the rest, ran his hand along the wall and shook his head in quiet admiration. Whoever built this, he said, understood forces. Not abstractly, but practically. He built something that wanted to stand. The decision to move the Wagon House was not made lightly. It required permits, funding, and consensus among institutions that rarely agreed quickly on anything. But the alternative, leaving it exposed to future storms and decay, was unacceptable. If the house was to continue its journey, it would have to leave the forest that had guarded it for so long. The extraction process was meticulous. The surrounding earth was cleared carefully to free the wheels without destabilizing the frame. Supports were added temporarily, not to replace the original structure, but to ensure it survived the transition intact. Watching the process, she felt a flicker of unease. The house had chosen stillness once, anchoring itself against necessity. Was it right to move it now? That question lingered until the moment the structure shifted for the first time. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The tension in the cables increased, the supports tightened, and then, with a sound like a long-held breath released, the Wagon House lifted free of the ground that had claimed it. Soil fell away from the wheels in dark clumps, roots snapping reluctantly. For the first time in generations, the house moved. The unease dissolved then, replaced by something closer to awe. This was not a violation. It was a continuation. The wagon had been built to move. Stillness had been a strategy, not a destiny. The journey to the city took 2 days. Roads were closed temporarily, traffic diverted. News cameras appeared, followed by journalists eager to frame the story in language that bordered on the sensational. She declined interviews, answering questions only when accuracy required it. This was not a story of miraculous discovery, she insisted. It was a story of preparation and survival. That distinction mattered to her, even if it did not make headlines. When the Wagon House arrived at the museum, it did so quietly, escorted by professionals rather than crowds. The building that would house it had been prepared in advance, reinforced floors, controlled climate, careful lighting. As the structure was rolled into position, she stood at the edge of the room, hands folded, observing not as an owner or hero, but as a witness to completion. Restoration followed documentation, not repair. Nothing was altered that did not need to be stabilized. The stove remained where it had always been. The markings on the wall were preserved, not cleaned. The floor panel concealing the valuables remained sealed, its contents documented, but left untouched. A choice that surprised many, but felt right to those who understood the builder's intentions. The house was not meant to be stripped. It was meant to be understood. The letters were displayed nearby, protected behind glass, their words transcribed for those unable to read the fading ink. The builder's name, once lost to footnotes and speculation, returned to public record. His family's path westward, their decision to stop, to build, to endure, took its place among countless other frontier stories, distinct not because of tragedy, but because of ingenuity. On opening day, she returned to the museum alone. Visitors moved through the space slowly, voices hushed without being asked, children pressed close to the glass, eyes wide. Adults lingered, reading, rereading, tracing diagrams with their gaze. Some saw a relic, others saw a lesson. She stood back, content to remain anonymous, listening as fragments of understanding surfaced in quiet conversations around her. What struck her most was how few people asked why the house had been abandoned. Instead, they asked how it had worked, how it had kept people alive, how much thought had gone into each decision. The focus had shifted, subtly but decisively, from loss to design, from failure to adaptation. She did not stay long. Outside, the city moved with its usual indifference to history. Cars passed, people hurried, the present asserting itself with familiar confidence. She walked a few blocks before stopping, turning once more in the direction of the museum. The house was inside now, sheltered by walls not of its own making, but the essence of it remained unchanged. In the days that followed, life resumed its quieter pace. Work reclaimed its place. Evenings returned. Yet something fundamental had shifted. She no longer sought solitude as refuge. She sought it as alignment, as she always had, but now with a clearer sense of continuity. The past was not distant or abstract. It lived alongside the present, waiting for those willing to notice. Sometimes she thought of the builder, not as a historical figure, but as a man making decisions under pressure, calculating risks, writing notes into wood because paper might not last. She thought of the night she had spent following his instructions, trusting his judgment without ever knowing his face. That trust had crossed time without ceremony. The Wagon house had reached the city, but its journey did not end there. It continued in the minds of those who walked through the exhibit, in the questions it prompted, in the quiet recalibration of what people imagined the past to be. It was no longer hidden. It was no longer alone. And neither, she realized, was she. The route she had chosen for its simplicity had altered her course irrevocably. She had entered the forest seeking silence and found responsibility instead. Not the heavy kind that demands sacrifice, but the steady kind that asks only attention and care. It was enough. Some structures are built to move, some are built to endure, and once in a while, something is built to do both, waiting patiently until the world is ready to carry it forward again. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Watch the next video and explore the other stories on the channel. Share this video with someone who values real stories and forgotten history.